tonight I've entitled this message, The Refinery, which at the first glance might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. It certainly makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And as I kind of flagged, I tested the title with my husband. I said, what do you think about The Refinery? He just cringed and just went, oh, yeah, I'm not sure about that. But can I tell you that I believe that this is a message of grace and hope and life. So if you stay with me on the journey, we'll get to a place of grace and hope. So stay with me. I think it's interesting that in every good story, there's always a moment that's like the point of no return. When whoever is the not the victim character, but the person that is in a situation where they come to a point where they've gone too far, but they need the hero to come and save them. They need the hero to come and swoop in and save the day. Like when Lois Lane falls from the building and we're waiting for Superman to come and catch her before she hits the ground. You know that moment where you're just like, is he going to come? Like the ground is very close. It's not too far away. And so there's a moment where you just go, you know, there's high stakes. If Superman doesn't come in, swoop in, it's not a very good end to the story. It's definitely not a love story. I recently, but sure enough, Superman comes in and saves Lois Lane and lifts her to the ground, and that it's all happy days. I recently watched Never Been Kissed, which I haven't watched for probably about over 10 years. It's such a classic though. And Drew Barrymore, if you don't know the story, Drew Barrymore is a reporter and she goes back to school. She ends up falling in love with her teacher, which is okay because she's old enough, but it becomes a little bit complicated in the film. She ends up putting out a report in the newspaper that says, you know, this amazing guy, all this stuff, and she goes to a baseball field and she stands in the middle of the baseball field and they put a 5-minute timer on in the hope that this guy has seen the published article that she's written and is going to respond in a timely manner because they didn't have mobile phones and social media back then when the film was made. There's this hope that he'll respond, this hope that he'll come through. And she's standing there and they put the 5-minute timer on and the stadium is jam-packed because of the article. And she stands there and the timer just counts down. And slowly you can see her hope just dropping little by little, and finally the timer gets to 0, and the guy hasn't come, and she just feels so defeated, and she, you know, drops the microphone that she's holding, and she just looks down. But just at that last moment, out of the corner of her eye, her Prince Charming is running down the stadium and he runs across the field to her, and it's a very wonderful, you know, they live happily ever after, and that's fantastic. But in every good storyline, there's that moment where you just don't know what the ending is going to look like. You just don't know. And so we're put in this position where you go, God, I'm having hope, but I don't know if you're going to come through here. And I know for my life that I have those moments as well. And in fact, when I reflected as I was preparing for this message, time after time after time again, in the middle of the storm, you just go, God, I don't know if you're going to come through here. I don't know if you're going to come through. I don't know if this time you're going to be faithful. But time and time again, I know that we serve a faithful God and that he comes in and he saves the day. So there's a moment in the story that we're going to look at tonight, which is a little bit like that. In that kind of point of no return, which is just fantastic. So if you're in the room tonight and you've had moments like that in your life where you've kind of gone, can I have hope for the future? Can I have hope for the future? Or maybe you're in a moment like that tonight already. Or maybe you're going to have a moment like that this year. Well, this message is for you. This message is for you. Because we know that moments like this are inevitable. They're part of the human condition. Well, tonight we're going to meet two characters in the Bible, and they could not be two more different characters in who they are and how they respond and how they behave. But as we look at them tonight, we're going to see they have this beautiful intertwined story where they meet and there is just blessing after blessing as they trust each other and trust God in what they do, and it's really exciting. But before we get into the message tonight, I just want to look at a little bit of the background of it. So this story takes place in the book of Kings, and I think it's really important that we understand just the background of what's happening behind the scenes to give a little bit more perspective on what's going on in the story. So, in the book of Kings, before the book of Kings were written, so there's Kings 1 and Kings 2, which originally was just a story all in itself. And in this, what is happening before the book of Kings is written is that King David, who was a great king after God's own heart, has spent a lot of time pursuing God, building God's house, unifying the 12 tribes of Israel, and bringing them on a journey to become one kingdom. And in this, there's the prophecy that out of the line of David will become like a messianic king, or someone who will establish God's kingdom on earth. And we know today that's Jesus Christ, and that's really exciting. But back then they didn't know. So they were waiting for this messianic king. And so the book of Kings actually tells us this story of a long line of kings that come after King David. And it talks about how they respond, how they hold their kingship, what they do with what they have. And ultimately, we see that none of them actually live up to the standards that are kind of written out, and very few of them are actually good kings. In fact, a lot of the time, it feels like the kings get worse and worse in how they respond to things. So we have this declining kind of kingdom and kingship that's going on. And so in this time, there's a lot of violence and destruction. So God raises up the prophets. The prophets are men who are raised up to kind of champion what God has said. So to champion his laws and champion the calling that is over Israel. So God raises up these prophets to challenge, correct, and champion the calling of God. So that's what's going on. And interestingly here, so the prophets are not fortune tellers. That's not what they're like. They're not like a wizard in a cape who walks around with maybe a magic ball or something. That's not what they're like. That's not what they're like. They're probably more like an auditor who has a list of requirements and goes, actually, you're not up to scratch here. Actually, that's not how God's called us to do things. Actually, I'm not sure about this. But the other thing that they did is they championed the calling of God. So they said, hey, Israel, God has called us to be a light to the nations. Hey, Israel, have you remembered God's promises? Hey, Israel, God has called us to go forth and share the light and the love that God has given us. So this is who the prophets were. So this story takes place around one of these prophets. So that's the main character here. And I don't know if you've ever been in a position where you've had to tell someone what they're doing wasn't quite up to scratch. That can sometimes be not a very fun conversation. Part of what I do, so I'm a nurse by nature, and part of what I do is actually in that is educate. And one of the requirements of that is making sure that nurses and doctors have their competencies that they require to fulfill their duties in the role. So that's what we do. And so part of that assessment is a pass-fail assessment. And so that's wonderful when you have someone who passes. Yeah, awesome, go for gold, that's fantastic. But when you have someone that doesn't quite cut it, that's a different story. And I'm sure as anyone who comes into healthcare, you want to know that the nurses and doctors who are looking after you are competent to do the skills that they require for the role. That's pretty important. So having these conversations can be really challenging and really difficult. And I can only imagine what that's like when you're coming, as the prophets would do, to a king who is a king over a nation to say, hey, you know what? What you did over there, that violence, that injustice, that's actually not okay. That's a hard conversation to have. That's pretty challenging. That's so challenging. So for a lot of the time, these prophets actually had to go and hide and pull themselves away just to protect themselves from maybe not being the most popular person in Israel at the time as they were coming to champion what God had called Israel to do. So tonight we're going to meet this character, and his name is Elijah. And what happens just before this story takes place is that Elijah confronts one of these kings, and his name is King Ahab. And I think my dad once taught me this. Mean King Ahab kept on being mean. It is a line that I think my dad taught me that I have just remembered. But the Bible actually says that King Ahab did more to provoke the anger of God than all the other kings that lived before him. Now, that's quite a challenge to live up to, and probably not one that you want to have. But as you can imagine, the things that anger God's heart is that injustice, that violence, that not standing for what's right, that bringing in the worship of other idols and things that tear down the fact that God is above all. That's what this king was doing. So Elijah had just confronted him, and then because what had happened is during King Ahab's reign is there had become this spiritual drought that had covered the land because King Ahab had married someone called Jezebel who brought in the worship of a god called Baal that wasn't the God of Israel. So they had established worship that was actually causing death and destruction in the land. And so there was this spiritual drought. So then what Elijah does, so he confronts the king and then he prophesies drought among the land. And I think that's really interesting because it images the spiritual drought that they'd brought in. So they brought in spiritual drought, and then Elijah had prophesied about an actual drought that had come across the land. So this is where we pick up the story. And so we're going to read 1 Kings 17, 8 to 16, and I've got the ESV version on the screen if you don't have your Bibles. But what I'd love us to do tonight is just read the story, and then we're going to go through section by section and just look at it, and it's going to be great. So we're going to get into it. So 1 Kings 17 verse 8, the widow of Zarephath. Then the word of the Lord came to him, arise, that's Elijah, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath, no questions asked. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a woman was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her again and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hands. And she said, as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. And that's the point of no return, when you're like, that's not somewhere where you want to be. You don't want to be preparing a meal for you and your son that you may go and eat it and die. That's not a good situation to be in. But then Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterwards, make me something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and all of her household ate for many, many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. It's a pretty amazing story. It's a pretty amazing story of how God makes a way. You know that song, Waymaker? In this story, God's making a way for a widow, for Elijah, and for all of the widow's household. It's just such an interesting story. And it all starts with the obedience of one man. It all starts with the obedience of one man. You know, the first thing that I want to pull out of this story tonight is that the test brings the testimony. And something really interesting is the location that God asks Elijah to go to. So the word Zarephath. So in verse 8 we read this. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there." And then he did that. And the word Zarephath, I think we have a screen for this, actually means refinery. It means the refinery or refinement. So it's interesting that God is calling Elijah to a place of refinery, to a place of refining, that hey, Elijah, I want you to go here and be in this place where you're going to be refined. Now that brings a little bit of a different perspective on it, because if God asked me to go to a place of refinement, I'm not sure that I would have been as obedient as Elijah was to just get up and go, to just have the obedience that comes with that. But I think Elijah knew that in the obedience there was a blessing. In the obedience there was a blessing, that God had something for him. So Zarephath means refinery. Now this is really interesting, and I'm such a fan of pottery. I appreciate pottery. I appreciate the hobby of pottery. I have watched probably hundreds of how-to guides on pottery. I follow all the hashtags, hashtag pottery, hashtag throwing wheel. I love pottery. I have never actually done it though. So let me first say that. So it's probably a hobby that I have without actually doing. I love the idea of pottery. I don't so much love getting my hands dirty. So I'm not sure if it's actually going to be a hobby that follows through, but I love learning about it. And the interesting thing about pottery, and this is a ceramic vessel. The interesting thing about pottery is that it takes, you can create a beautiful vase, you can create a beautiful piece of work, you can create something that's wonderful, that's useful, but until you fire it, it is useless. Because it can't carry anything, it can't hold anything, you can't do anything with it, because when you pick it up, it's going to break. You can't give it to anything. It's useless in its first form as being clay. You have to take it through the firing season. You have to put it in the kiln and heat it up and fire it. And then post-firing, it becomes something that's useful, something that can carry things, something that is that endures, something that withstands pressure. It becomes so much more versatile and useful as you let it go through the firing process. And so God is calling Elijah to a place of refinery, to a place of firing. And it's interesting, a couple of things about pottery that I've learnt is that you can't just put wet clay into a kiln. You have to wait for it to dry. And the drying phase takes about a week. So it takes about 7 days. You have to let it dry completely, or as much as you possibly can. And if you want to go home and do some pottery, I've learnt that you know that it's dry because when you touch it, it's not cold. There you go. Fun facts with Elise. So you get your piece of pottery that you touch and it's not cold, and you put it in the kiln, and then it goes through these phases. So first of all, the kiln heats up to about 100 or just under 100 degrees Celsius. So it heats up to boiling point because it has to have the final drying process. So you dry it out, but even when you dry it out to the point that you touch it and it's not cold, so you can put it in the kiln, in that phase, there's still water molecules that are bound in the clay. So you have to have the final drying process. So you heat it up to 100 and you heat up to 100. So the boiling point for a number of hours. If you heat it up too quickly, the water molecules will actually expand too quickly, and the vase or whatever you're firing will explode in the kiln. So you have to be really precise. So you heat it up just to boiling point, you leave it there for a couple of hours, and then after that period of time, you then heat it up further. And what happens is then a ceramic change happens. So the next thing that you do is you heat it up to about, I believe, pardon my ignorance, I'm not a potter, I believe about 500 degrees Celsius, which if you're complaining about how hot it's been lately, It's not 500 degrees Celsius. So you heat it up to 500 degrees Celsius, and it has to stay there for several more hours again. And then you've got the cool down process. So in cooling down as well, if you open the kiln too quickly, something happens called thermal shock, where the pieces actually break if it cools down too quickly. So it's a very precise thing, firing pieces of clay. But the outcome is that they are able to endure, that they're able to sustain pressure, that they're able to hold things, that they don't crack when you touch them. The end pressure is amazing, so the end result is amazing, but the process takes time, takes so much time. And I think in God refining us, in God changing who we are to be more like Him, we need to be aware that the refining process takes time. It takes time. And if we try and rush it, if we try and get to the end phase, we try and figure out what God's trying to teach us and get there quickly, or we quit that job because, that job was really hard and I just didn't feel like, it was too much pressure. If we try and jump out of situations too quickly, it breaks that refining process. So, the first thing I want to say is refining takes time and precision. But isn't it good that we have a God that is with us every step of the way? That we have a God who is precise? That we have a God that provides everything that we need for the season that we're in? That as we trust Him and we seek Him, that God is going to give us all that we need for the season that we're in. Refining takes time. Ephesians 64 verse 8 says, "But now, O Lord, you are our Father and we are the clay. You are our potter, we are the work of your hand." And Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So Zarephath means refinery. The second thing that I think is astonishing about the location is that Zarephath actually sits in Sidon, which at that time was under the reign of the Queen of Jezebel, which, that's not fantastic. So God called Elijah to the place that was in the midst of his enemies. The place that was in the midst of his enemies, that was out of the protection of Israel, that was in the midst of his enemies. That's pretty full on. And it brings some perspective about the obedience that Elijah had. That at the voice of God, Elijah said, I'm going to go. I'm going to go. It doesn't matter that this is a place of refinery. It doesn't matter that this is in the midst of my enemies. I'm going to go because I know that when God speaks and when we follow the plans and purposes that we have for God, when He is there, our obedience brings about blessing. Our obedience brings about blessing. And yet Elijah was obedient. He was obedient to the calling of God. The commandment in this scripture is almost twofold. So God commands Elijah, but God also has a commandment for the woman. And I think this is really interesting. So if we go back up to verse 8, then the word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have..." And this is the interesting bit. "Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." I have commanded a widow there to feed you. What's interesting about this is that God had commanded this widow who didn't even know she had the capacity to fulfill what God was calling her to do. God had called her, commissioned her, had already made a plan and a way for her, that even in her midst of hopelessness, God was calling her out. God was calling her out. And I wonder what God is calling us to as Emerge and individually that we don't even know we have capacity for yet, but God has for us in 2020, that God is making a way and He has a plan and a purpose for our lives. As Elijah was obedient, also the widow was obedient with what she had. This woman I think is pretty amazing because in this society, to be a woman, you were a pretty low class. But then to be a widow without a husband, you were an even lower class. But you see, in Israel, there was provision. So God, being a God of love, had said, protect the widows and the young children. In Sidon, there was no protection there. There was not the protection of God. And so this woman was in this place of helplessness, this place of being the bottom of the bottom, not having or knowing potentially the love of God. She was in this place, and Elijah comes and speaks to her. He speaks to her. You know, when God asks you to step out and face this faith this year, remember that obedience brings the blessing. When God asks you to go places where you didn't think you'd go, to be in places where you didn't think you'd be, remember that obedience brings the blessing. Obedience brings the blessing. 2 Timothy 1 verse 8 says, He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything that we have done, but because of His own purpose and grace. This grace was given to us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Just as God has grace for us, we see in this story God have grace for this widow. God have grace for this widow. So we see Elijah was called to a place of refinement, and Elijah was obedient to this calling. But I wonder if Elijah had thought that maybe the widow he was going to see was going to be wealthy or affluent or have money or be someone that could provide, because that's what God had commanded. And it's interesting that when he gets to the gates of Zarephath, what he finds is a widow collecting sticks. A widow collecting sticks. Now, if you're looking for someone who's got wealth, you're probably not looking for the person who's collecting their own sticks. Because people who were more wealthy might have someone that could go out and get the sticks for them, But Elijah finds this woman in this place of hopelessness as she's collecting her own sticks. And I want to just look at that word sticks for a second. And in Hebrew, the word sticks is this. It's etz or etz. And it comes from the root word of tree. And the thing about the Hebrew language was they had very few words, but they jam-packed a lot of meaning into each of these words. So this is one of the words. So the word etz also means wood, it means carpenter, it means gallows, it means pine, plank, tree. It has all this meaning in one word. And there's this imagery that happens. So this widow is there collecting sticks. And she says this incredible thing. She says, and now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. So she's gathering sticks that will lead to death. She's gathering sticks that will lead to death. What's interesting about this is there's another verse that the person who wrote this knows very well, and it's the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden, and she goes to an etz. And she chooses the etz that leads to death. She chooses the etz that leads to death. There are two trees in the garden, and God says, you can have all of the trees but this one. Don't have the one that leads to death. And so Eve goes along and she chooses the etz that leads to death. And we find this woman in this scripture as she's gathering sticks. She's gathering sticks that leads to death. And it's not I don't think it's a death that she has chosen of her own. We know that this woman is a widow, that she doesn't have a husband. We don't know how her husband died, but we know she's a widow. We know that she's in a community where there's drought. And if I've learned anything about drought recently, it's that drought affects the whole community. And you know, as people have to spend more money on livestock and water and all these different things because there's no water, that everyone in the community is affected. So the people that are going to be most affected are those that are vulnerable, i.e. widows. So this widow is in a place where, not because of her own volition, not because of anything that she has done, she's in a place where she's collecting the sticks of death. And then Elijah comes in And Elijah speaks what I'm sure were the first words of hope that she had heard in a really long time. The first words of hope that said, you no longer need to be afraid. You no longer need to be fearful. You no longer need to be scared of death, but that I've got something more for you. I've got something more for you. And we see Elijah bring this beautiful word of promise to her. And it says this, if I can just find it. Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the flour shall not be spent and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And then she went and did. You know, I think in this moment we see a salvation story where someone who was lost, was in a hopeless state, was in a place where out of no choice of their own, they were gathering the sticks of death. That God comes in and the man of God speaks words of hope that says, you know what, there's a different way. You don't have to walk this way. You don't have to live this way. There is more for you in this. There is more for you. But you know, each of us get to choose our own sticks. And each of us have moments in every single day where we get to either choose the sticks of life and trust the promises of God, or we get to choose the sticks of death, which is, you know, criticism and complaint, and this is my lot in life, and God can't bring me through this. Each of us have a choice about the sticks that we choose every single day, every single day. What sticks are you choosing? What sticks are you gathering for yourself and your family? Hebrews 9 verse 28 says, so Christ had once suffered to bear the sins of many, and to them that look to him, and to them that look for him shall appear the second time without sin for salvation. We know salvation comes from God and comes from God alone. And I love this story that it is a salvation message about how God speaks hope and saves this woman, her family, and all the people around them. You know, God's promises provide provision. God's promises provide provision for us in our life. In verse 13, we read Elijah saying this beautiful statement about do not fear. Do not fear. And what power are in these words? But you know, the interesting thing is that these words were actually an act of faith for Elijah as much as they were for the widow. Because we can't forget that Elijah needed this miracle as well. He was in a place where the brook had run dry. He was in a place that didn't have any food any longer. He was coming in. He needed the provision of God as much as this widow did. And so these are words of faith. And you know, I think in this place of refinery, this place of God refining Elijah, he was growing his faith. He was growing his faith. He was nurturing the faith and the calling that was on his life to grow and be made stronger and to be able to endure what was ahead of him. And you can go and read the rest of Elijah's story, but he does some incredible things because of God, through God. His life is just amazing. And so in this place, as Elijah chooses to speak the words of faith and hope and life, we see that God brings the miracle. God brings the provision from the promise that Elijah has. It's amazing. Psalm 9:9-10 says this, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. For those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. Can I encourage you, in every situation, seek God. You will never regret seeking God, seeking his face. You will never regret seeking who he is. You will never regret seeking him in the place of triumph, in the place of refinery. In that place, you will never regret seeking him. It's amazing. You know, in these situations, as we find ourselves in high-risk moments of life, we can trust in the promise of God. We can choose the sticks that lead to life, and we can know that there is blessing in the obedience. There is blessing in the obedience. You know, I know for myself and Kyle that we've been in that moment, that place of the point of no return, where you're not sure if God's going to come through. You're not sure how the ending of the story is going to take place. We've seen God provide jobs for both of us. We've seen God make provision in places where health circumstances really aren't okay, really aren't good. We've seen God move in our finances. We've seen God be faithful time and time and time again as we trust Him, as we seek Him, as we choose to speak in faith and choose the sticks that lead to life. We've seen God move in our lives. So the widow is gathering sticks, and she hears the good news of God's salvation. But then there's this outworking of the miracle. So she's got her promise. She's got what she needs for her next season. But then she has to go back to her home. She has to go back to the place that she was previously. And she has to look her very hungry, I'm sure, son in the eyes and say, you know what? This meal that we were going to make for ourselves, we're actually going to give it to someone else. And we see her take the little bit of flour. She makes her fire. She takes the little bit of flour that she has. She takes the little bit of oil that she has. And she mixes it together, and we see her use what she has in her hand to bless the man of God. To bless the man of God. She still has to outwork the miracle in her life. Outwork it. She still has to be the one to work the fire and then mix the flour and the oil together. She has to be the one to create the dough, to put that dough in a place of warmth. I'm sure that she's hungry. I'm sure that she's looking at that dough going, that would be pretty good right now. I would really like to eat that. And then she has to go and take that little bit that she has in her hand to the man of God. And she's that act of obedience to just go, this little bit that I have, I'm giving it to you. I'm giving it to you. And before she sees the promise fulfilled, she has to give what's in her hand over to God. Over to God. But you know what? I think, and what I've seen, is that our service makes room for God to outwork in our lives. As we serve God, it makes room for God to do something in our lives, in the lives around us, in our households' lives. It makes room. Our service, as we are willing to give the little that we have in our hands to God, God is like, great, I can use that. I can do something with that. It makes room for God to work in our lives. It makes room for God to work in our lives. And I have no doubt that as she went back home to make the flour and to make the bread for her own family, the joy and excitement that was coming just as she was able to see the miracle at hand. She trusted the promise. She'd been obedient to the promise, but then outworking that miracle. But that miracle didn't just last one day. That breakthrough didn't just last one day. That breakthrough lasted all until the rain started again. And you know, as Elijah came and lived at her house and she was able to serve him and she was able to make food for him every single day, I'm sure that brought about a blessing in her life, that it brought about a blessing that she didn't expect, that as her son sat at the table and listened to the stories about what God had done in Elijah's life, what Elijah thought was in him to do for the rest of his life, what God was speaking through Elijah, that blessed not only her, but it blessed the whole household. It blessed her son as her son got to see the miracle at hand, that way-making God that they got to witness every single day. As we serve, it makes room for God to do something in us. It makes room for God to do something in us. Matthew 16:24-26 says this, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must first deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be to gain the whole world if you forfeit your soul? Or what can anyone give exchange for their soul?'" And I think as Christians, we often see this receiving and giving as kind of two separate things. You know, and you may have heard people say, I just really need to receive this morning. I just really need to receive something for myself. Or I'm just really feeling like I need to give today. I'm just really feeling like we need to do more in the giving world. And often I think as Christians, we see this receiving and giving as being mutually exclusive. That they don't really talk to each other. But in this story, we see Elijah giving. We see him giving life and hope and grace and salvation to this woman. We see him speaking words over her. And out of that, he receives the blessing of being fed. Come on, what a blessing. And for the woman, we see as she gives the little that is in her hand to the man of God, that she receives a blessing beyond anything she could imagine. She sees her capacity grow. She sees her ability to be able to serve grow. I'm sure that for many, many years she had not been able to serve anyone because she didn't have capacity to. But we see in this, as she gives, that there is a receiving for her and a receiving for her household and a receiving for her son, that as she serves, there's this receiving for her. And I wonder what God is asking us to serve in this year. I wonder what God is asking us to give this year over to Him that He is going to bless us out of, but He is asking for us to give something over to Him, to give something. You know, finally, I just want to look at each day brings a new blessing. The interesting thing I think about this story is that there wasn't this miraculous, that, you know, the oil was pouring over and they had to get everyone in the neighborhood to like bring a vessel and to bring a jar so that they could fill up everything because there was just too much oil for all of them. That wasn't the provision that they received, although God can do that, absolutely. But the provision that they received was provision for every single day. Every single day, that every single day there was a little bit of oil, that they had to trust God, that God again was going to work His miracle, that God again was going to do what He promised He would do, that God again was going to work in their life to provide for them, that every single day brought a new day of choosing the sticks of life, that even though, you know, I still only have a little bit of oil, I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust in the God who has been faithful for the days before. I'm going to trust in the God who provided yesterday. I'm going to trust in Him again. I'm going to choose to speak words of life. I'm going to choose to believe that God is going to do something in my lives today. And for them, it was a blessing and a miracle that occurred every single day. Every single day they had to trust in God. They had to trust in God to outwork what He was doing. Matthew 6:25-34 says this, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble on its own." You know, I believe that as you and all of us are placed in moments where we're in the refinery this year, we're in a place where it might get a little bit hot, it might get a little bit warm, that as we trust God, as we seek Him, as we're obedient to Him, as we choose the sticks of life, as we believe that His promises bring provision, as we choose to serve with the little bit that we have, that God will make a room for us, that God will make a way for us, that God's blessings will come day in and day out because He is faithful. I'd like to invite the band up tonight. James 1:2-4 says this, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." You know, I always found that scripture really challenging, really something that I struggled with. But you know that as we trust God, that going through the fire, He is going to be with us, that He doesn't leave us nor forsake us, that he is trustworthy, that he is faithful, that as we are put through places where it's refining us, as we go through this refining process, as we trust in him, know that there is something happening within us, that there is something happening that God is calling us to be giant fighters, to be giant slayers. You know, Danny spoke about her prophecy was about King David. And the interesting thing about King David is that he didn't fight the giant first. No, God actually taught him. He taught him how to fight. He taught him how to fight and protect the sheep. He taught him with the bear. He taught him with the lion. And eventually he became a giant slayer, I believe that God has giant slayers in this house, that God has giant slayers in Emerge, that God is calling us to fight things that maybe haven't been fought through generations, but this is it. This is where it ends. This is where it ends. God is calling us to take us into new places, to break through things that haven't been broken through before. God is raising up giant slayers in this place. But we have to get there by trusting him day in, day out, choosing the sticks of life, choosing to believe that today he will be as faithful as he has been yesterday, choosing to believe that he is a faithful God, a God who loves us so much, a God who loves us so very much. You know, there was someone else who went through many, many trials, and it never fazed him. Although he went through trials, Jesus Christ always stood firm, always stood firm, to the point that when it came to his death, he was stood in front of a judge and a jury and they found him not guilty. Not guilty. Even when people came and they had negative words, they had false accusations to say about him. This is what it says in Luke 23, verse 13 to 15 about Jesus Christ. It says, "Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders among the people, and he announced his verdict." This is his verdict. "You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence, and I find him innocent." You know, Jesus Christ, being innocent of sin, went to a cross for you and I. So that you and I didn't have to live in the sticks of death any longer. We didn't have to live in the place of hopelessness any longer, but he took our sin and our shame upon his shoulders and he went to the cross for you and I, so that you and I can have a hope in him, so that you and I can have the salvation that this lady has in the story, so that you and I can take the sticks of life and go, Jesus Christ paid it all for me, that I don't need to be afraid, I don't need to be fearful, but I can fear not of the worry that tomorrow holds, because I know my God is above it all. I know my God is above it all.